Our next speaker on the program is Dr. Martin Niashati, and Martin's professor and associate head in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Manitoba. He holds a BSc degree in agriculture from the University of Nairobi and an MS and PhD degrees in animal nutrition in both poultry and swine nutrition from the University of Guelph. Martin's current research focuses on nutrition and gut health in the non-ruminant energy and nutrient, most notably nitrogen and phosphorus nutrition and utilization, and feed ingredient evaluation. He's won many awards for his accomplishments in research. He's a noted educator, and I'm always a little intimidated when I'm around Martin because he's way smarter than me, and he's always the best looking guy in the room too, so always a sharp dresser. Today Martin's going to talk to us about low crude protein diets and its effects on diarrhea. So Martin, thank you.
Yeah. God.
Just stick it in the bucket.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. You can hear me all right? Okay. Before I get started, I would like to thank the program committee for including me in the program today. We've already had really excellent talks, and I hope I will not disappoint you. Also, I just wanted to very quickly say I was very happy at the beginning with those words that Dr. Lindemann talked about the two great friends of ours that have gone before us. And I just remembered the comment that Martin made, that that professor that takes a risk on a graduate student and turns that graduate student his life around. Case DeLang was that professor for me. I knew nothing about swine nutrition, but he took the risk and took me on as his first PhD student, and here I am today, and I do miss him, just like many of you will, dearly. Okay, so I would like to address this talk a little bit. We have had already two very nice talks that have laid the background or the way for what I'm going to talk about. As you've heard already from Dr. Lach, I am not a microbiologist or immunologist, so we already have had a really nice primer for that. And I will be making some references to that, but I think we are now at a level where we can all be able to have this conversation. So the topic that I was asked to address is use of raw crude protein diets in managing intestinal problems in weaned pigs. And what I would like to cover a little bit is to just provide a little bit of a background information, which unfortunately might overlap a little bit with what we've already heard. And then I'll talk a little bit about the actual diet protein content in a pig diet and why that is a focus, why the interest in this area, and a little bit about what the thought is about the mechanisms that are involved, how these might be able to mitigate gut health or gut health outcomes in young animals. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the studies that have been done specifically to address or to evaluate the potential of dietary protein content and, in fact, composition on gut health outcomes in animals. Then some issues that we need to talk about in terms of practical application of this concept, and then I will wrap it up. So we've already seen from Adam some good background already about stress that the piglets undergo during the process of weaning. So we have all these events taking place, multiple challenges that the piglet faces during the process of being weaned. And those add up to a situation where the piglets are not able to consume as much feed during those first few days after weaning, and that leads to a number of changes within the digestive system, which eventually then may lead to any one of these conditions happening, changes the gut microbial population or composition, and also might influence the gut barrier function, for example, that Adam talked about, and therefore leads to malabsorption of compounds from the gut that should otherwise not be absorbed. And then we see the situation that is developing, the post-weaning diarrhea incidences in weaned pigs, and eventually we see a compromised growth of those young animals. And in terms of what happens to at the gut level, then we see some of those changes taking place along the epithelial, particularly morphological changes within the gut. So the other thing that I wanted to mention here, because I think many of us in this audience are aware of this, is that for a very long time we've used in-feed antibiotics to manage some of the situations that we've talked about in that previous slide. And we've done so because there's a lot of information, practical information generated in various research settings that clearly shows that when you put antibiotics in animal diets, you do have a response, a growth response. And that growth response is much more pronounced in younger pigs than in much older pigs. So this we've known for a long time, and that's why we've used those in our diets for our young animals. But for various reasons that I'm very sure are very familiar to many of us in this audience, it's not fashionable anymore for us to use in-feed antibiotics in the way we feed animals. We can debate that for a very long time, but I will leave that debate for today and just accept, and I hope that you will accept with me that the days are numbered for when we are allowed to use those antibiotics in animal feeds for various reasons, and whether we like it or not, that's a reality, and I think we have to do something about it. And the industry is already doing something about it, and of course the scientific community as well. There are many approaches that are being looked at. For example, how we manage animals in general terms, or use of functional feeds, that are functional ingredients that might influence the way the animal handles changes within the digestive system. So that's all I'm going to say in that regard, and move on to another potential way we can then address or respond to those changes in availability of in-feed antibiotics that we've relied on for a long time. One of the things we can do is that we can manipulate the diet to try and help the pig deal with that stress that is associated with the weaning process. As already we've heard from both Mark and Adam, whatever diet that we will subject these pigs to has a huge influence on the entire gut microbiome. I learned already today that we probably don't know exactly what happens, and that probably explains why, when you look at the literature, a lot of the responses that people have seen are contradictory at times, and in many other cases, very, very difficult to try and draw a close line or a neat line that connects one dot to the other. But what is really clear is that diet does have an impact, and that various components within the diet do have specific impact on the way the digestive function in the piglet responds when the pig consumes these specific compounds. For example, specific carbohydrates have specific effects on how the piglets respond. But also, the dietary protein content, as well as the composition of that dietary protein, does have a huge impact on what happens in terms of digestive physiology in young pigs. And that's what I will talk about, is focusing more on that protein component. I got this from a presentation that was posted actually online. So it's a nice figure that summarizes what happens to the protein that the animal consumes. Essentially, any nitrogen that is not, for protein that is not digested and absorbed by the end of the small intestine enters the large intestine and potentially then becomes fermentable protein. it is subjected to fermentation by the various bugs that stay or inhabit that part of the large intestine. And what we know about protein fermentation is that that process leads to a number of metabolites that are being released. Many of these metabolites in small quantities, in smaller concentrations, are not harmful. In fact, they are very important to the proper functioning of digestive physiology or gut physiology. But in large quantities, they become essentially toxic. They can lead to major changes or damage to the gut epithelium, and therefore lead to a cascade of events that will lead to diarrhea and other conditions within the animal. So this is why it is important, or at least the focus has been directed towards protein or dietary protein and the potential that it may lead to this number of outcomes down here. So we've known for a very long time, already this paper that was published in the 80s by Ron Bohr and Frank Hahn at the University of Alberta, indicating that protein is a predisposing factor to secretory diarrhea in young pigs. And also the fact that bacteria that tend to be pathogenic in nature are preferentially or prefer to ferment protein as opposed to carbohydrates in the diet. So if we provide that substrate in large quantities, then there is potential that we will increase the proliferation of the so-called pathogenic bacteria, or the bacteria that causes diseases. And therefore, if you think about the way we feed young pigs, we formulate starter diets, very high protein content in the diet, and the fact that if you look at the idiodigestibility of that protein, you will realize that much of that protein, for almost half or 40% of that protein goes through the animals to the large intestine. So the higher the protein that we provide in the diet, then we are likely to increase the quantity of that protein that ends up in the large intestine, and therefore becomes potentially available for fermentation, and then lead to the production of those metabolites that I talked about that will easily or potentially compromise the integrity of the gut. So we can argue that that situation will likely become worse in a situation where we remove some of these additives, and particularly the antimicrobial growth promoters from the diet. That if we did that, then can combine that with the high protein, we will make that situation worse. So it is because of that thinking then that there is the thinking that low protein diet, if we can reduce the amount of protein, then we can minimize chances that those piglets are going to, or will see those enteric disturbances in the pigs. And more so if we are going to remove these antibiotics from the diet. So with that thinking, there's been a lot of studies that have been done in the last 10 years or so to try and see whether indeed by reducing the dietary protein levels in the diet, we can minimize disturbances or diarrhea occurrences in young pigs. And then the thinking here is that, of course, that by reducing or using a raw crude protein diet, is that we will minimize the activities or proliferation of pathogenic bacteria within the gut, and therefore we can minimize the production of those metabolic or toxic metabolites and maintain the functioning of the gut. And therefore avoid the conditions that leads to post-weaning diarrhea that we see. The other interest has been if we're going to use this as a strategy, how will it function, or how will we utilize it in the presence of all other additives that we use in the diet to try and address the same issue. So there is, whether or not there is a synergistic effect between a raw crude protein diet and other strategies that we could use. The other aspects that we can argue is that, of course, if we have those metabolites, for example, high levels of ammonia, it has to be absorbed, and then it has to be eliminated from the body. And by so doing, that can interfere as well with the efficiency of energy and nutrient utilization within the animal. So we can make those kind of inferences. But before I go too far, the question that came to my mind immediately when I started thinking about this talk, even though I've been working in this area for a while, is what is a low crude protein diet? And then I've looked through the literature. I cannot tell you exactly what that diet is. What is a low crude protein diet? If you look at what levels of maybe a standard diet for pig, for the protein levels, you say it's 21%. So is 20% low? Or is 19, 15, 16, 14? What is a low crude protein diet? And I show you here a few studies. You can see what people have tried to do, looking at 3-4% reductions, and in some cases, quite a bit of a reduction, and describing that as a low crude protein diet. But if you look at the literature from the time this concept first came into the scene, mainly as a way of managing protein utilization in growing finishing pigs, and the issues about carcass composition and reducing nitrogen excretion in the environment, the consensus was that maybe a reduction of about 4% units then gives us a diet that we can work with. So if you are starting with 22, then you are talking about 18, or from 21 to about 17% crude protein content in the diet. What happens though is that as soon as you do that, you run into issues with being able to supply the essential amino acids, some of the essential amino acids to meet requirement for the pig. So to be able to do so, we have to supplement these raw crude protein diets with crystalline amino acids. So we've been working in this area for quite a bit and done quite a few studies, as have done other people. And essentially, as I indicated, what you see very invariably in all the studies is that when you reduce crude protein diet, you do reduce some of those metabolites, one of which is the ammonia levels in the digestive system. So that declines with the reductions in crude protein content. Dr. Hale, Cherry Hale, who was a PhD student of John Prasky at Murdoch University, summarized and tried to create a relationship, or a correlation anyways, between dietary nitrogen intake and fecal ammonia level, and there was that decent correlation between the two. And also, more recently, there was a paper that came out of a group in China that showed that some of these compounds, for some of the compounds that also are derived from protein fermentation, do increase with a high protein diet. And those might also have impact on digestive physiology. So what about the actual diarrhea itself? Here is again a group of, or a slide from Cherry's PhD thesis, looking at a number of experiments and essentially indicating that as you increase nitrogen intake, you also increase the incidences of post-weaning diarrhea in pigs. And there's been a lot of other studies that have been done to look at that and essentially showed a similar trend. What is not very clear is whether that relationship holds true in a situation where pigs are raised in a normal environment whereby they are not subjected to a disease or an active disease challenge. Because those data sets that went into deriving that graph were from challenge studies. And what you can see from this graph here is that it's depending on the health status of that pig, you do get a very different responses to a high and low crude protein diet. You tend to see a much bigger benefit if there was a disease infection already going on in those pigs. The other thing that we've seen here is looking at what happens when we feed a low crude protein diet to a pathogen such as E. coli K88. For these What you're looking at here is a study where pigs were challenged and then killed, and looking at the levels of the pathogen itself, E. coli 88 in digester, 3 days later, and then 7 days later. And looking at the number of pigs that were positive for E. coli and those that were not positive. And essentially what you see here is that during the first 3 days, essentially, the pigs that consumed a raw protein diet did not show the numbers for E. coli K88. And then 7 days later, there was a few of those, about 20% of those animals that showed the proliferation of E. coli K88 in their digester. And then that data correlates very well with this gut morphology data, and this is just looking at villi height to crab depth ratio. The higher the number, the better. And essentially what you're looking at is two diets, high protein, low protein with amino acid supplementation, and looking at changes in gut morphology that tends to show that there is a favor towards the use of a low crude protein diet in maintaining gut morphology in these challenged pigs. And in a subsequent study, looking at the number of E. coli K88 attached to the mucosal layer. Because during the pathogenesis of E. coli, for it to be able to cause the disease, first of all, it has to be able to attach to the gut mucosa before it is able to elaborate the toxins that then leads to the cascade of events that leads to post-weaning diarrhea. And again, here, what was very clear from this study is that for the pigs that consumed a raw crude protein diet, very few of those E. coli K88 were found to be associated with the gut mucosa, indicating that in that situation of feeding a raw crude protein diet, we were able to interfere with the ability of E. coli K88 to attach and therefore potentially be able to cause a disease. So it is really clear that there is a relationship, or at least that there is an importance or a reason for us to look at the protein content, and potentially also on the protein composition in the diet, that in a way that it affects the gut microbiota or the gut microbiome. What is really not clear, as I indicated already, is the nature of that relationship. Because you look at various studies, you see one outcome, and you look at another study, and you see a totally different outcome, which really ties in with what Mark was saying. It's probably part of the fact that we do not fully understand what the gut microbiome is and what really drives it, and whether that is always consistent, that you do A and you get B. But what we've also seen and others have reported is that for sure, in many cases, when we feed a raw crude protein diet, you do see a shift in terms of the so-called beneficial bacteria relative to the pathogenic bacteria within the digestive system. And this is what I'm showing here in this right here. Again, piglets were challenged with an E. coli K88, and then looking at different groups of bacteria within the digestive system. And in this right here, essentially what the slide shows is that the feeding a raw crude protein diet, 17%, we were able to see a reduction in groups of bacteria that are associated with the pathogenic effects within the gut. And in the same study, we were able to see an elevation of those bacteria or groups of bacteria that are associated with the beneficial effects within the digestive system. As I indicated, one other thing that is of interest is to ask the question, how, if we are to use a low crude protein diet, how does that interact or with the other interventions that we might be able to use to manage gut digestive physiology in a pig in terms of maintaining an optimally functioning gut. And the data I'm showing you here is a study in which pigs were fed either high protein or a raw crude protein diet and supplemented with a probiotic. And essentially, what we were able to show here is that with a raw crude protein diet supplemented with a probiotic in both the high protein and low protein diet, there was that synergistic effect between the use of raw crude protein diet and a probiotic in combination. And that is, this data is from the same study, looking at the total numbers or counts of ETEC within the digester of those piglets. And you can see there already, for example, for the controls there, significant reductions of ETEC in the pigs that were fed the raw protein diet in this study. Same thing with the diarrhea scores that we corrected or noted in this study, reductions for those pigs that were fed a raw protein diet supplemented with a probiotic. And essentially, we concluded from this study that there was a synergistic effect between the use of a raw crude protein diet and the probiotics that we tested in mitigating or modulating the outcomes, gut health outcomes that we were able to measure. And in fact, there is a study that was published not too long ago, I think it's 2014, from the group in Mexico, and essentially showing exactly the same thing. What was not done in this study is that there was no treatment that did not contain just a raw crude protein diet itself, but essentially they had a controlled diet here, a high protein diet, and then a high protein diet with an antibiotic, high protein diet without an antibiotic, and a raw protein diet with a probiotic. And essentially, they were able to show that by combining a raw protein diet with a probiotic, they were able to get the same kind of response as the high protein diet with an antibiotic. In terms of considerations, just to wrap up here, one of the biggest comment that I've had is that when we use a raw crude protein diet, depending on how you formulate that diet, you tend to see a reduction in performance. So there's loss of performance in terms of growth of those piglets, and that can be a problem. But there's also potential, or there's been evidence that piglets, even though they suffer a little bit during that time, they do actually grow on to catch up later on, and therefore that should not be a problem. And there's a few studies that have been done already to show that might be the case. So, for example, in one of the studies that we did earlier on this topic, we saw that nice staircase reduction in growth performance. Even though we thought that we formulated those diets very well, supplemented with amino acids, and we thought we had everything covered because before that, there are studies in the literature already 20 years ago that showed that if you formulate low crude protein diet and you supplement with amino acids, essential amino acids, you can maintain performance. So we didn't expect to see that staircase loss in performance in the study. But we did. And since that time, there's been other groups that have worked in this area and try to find out whether we can put together diets that will still be able to maintain performance. And this is a recent publication from China Graduate University, essentially showing that by formulating the low crude protein diet with the normal amino acids, and I call them normal, or the ones that we worry about usually, methionine, lysine, threonine, and tryptophan. Here they included isoleucine, leucine, and valine as well, and they were able to show that you maintain the same level of performance. And when actually we looked at our own data later on, after the fact, we did realize that some of those branched-chain amino acids may have been limiting performance, and that's why we were not able to maintain performance in those pigs. In this study here, interesting, there's a lot more measurements in there on gut barrier function. Very, very interesting that if you wanted to look at the study itself, that indicated that it's by feeding this diet, we were able to support various other functions within the gut. So barrier functions within those pigs. And this is a study out of Australia. In the nursery phase, the pigs that were fed the raw protein diet performed very poorly. But those pigs were carried all the way through to market. And essentially what they showed is that in the end, those pigs ended up at the same place. So then that leads me to think that we should probably not focus too much on that slight loss in performance during the nursery phase, because pigs will go on to do just fine. So just to wrap up then, I think there's no doubt that dietary protein content as well as composition, I didn't talk too much about composition here, but there's no doubt that it does modulate gut microbiome. So it has an impact. What that impact is exactly is something that I'm sure we will be able to learn with time as time goes on. But based on the data that we have to date, it's obvious to me that it does change the composition, the diversity of the various populations, and certainly tends to favor the so-called beneficial bacteria in the gut at the expense of pathogenic bacteria. Something else that I didn't talk about here, but there is also data to suggest that the feeding a raw crude protein diet does influence the inflammatory responses in pigs as well. Because if you think back to the study, the presentation of Adam and Mark, you will then be able to see why that is the case. Because the protein will influence the bacteria, and therefore they start crosstalk that happens that will lead to the changes that we see in terms of inflammatory responses in these pigs. So feeding a raw protein, amino acid supplemented diet would maintain gut health, the integrity of gut health based on the data that we have to date. So how we formulate those diets will be the critical thing that we have to worry about, making sure that the adequate levels of those amino acids that will influence the responses are provided in the diet. And really, I think piglets will catch up if we were not able to do so later on in their life through compensatory growth. What is not very well documented yet is how we can use the low crude protein diets in the midst of all these other interventions that are available that we are currently using. That I think needs to be documented a little bit, or needs to be investigated a little bit so that we can know how we put together those diets relative to the other interventions that we put in the diet. Just before I stop talking here, I just want to thank Bara, a PhD student in my lab. Bara really helped me in putting together this, and he co-authored the proceedings that is in the book. And I want to thank these organizations because they funded many of the studies whose data that I shared with you today. And with that, then, I thank you once again for your attention, and thank you very much.